Okay. Right. I'm going to check this. I'm going to check the stream now to see if we are indeed live. Oh, we are. Wow, it actually worked. Okay. Now I'm going to check YouTube to see if it went live on YouTube. Oh, and it worked on YouTube. I feel so powerful all of a sudden. Wow, it actually worked. Right, here we go. Okay, let's just get this started. Hafa day, todos hams bueno hudzo ni omega. Gi Facebook, pat gi YouTube. Hafa day to everyone watching and listening on Facebook and on YouTube. Guawi host Midzutalu. I'm once again your host, Michael Lujan Bavacqua, and I am super duper excited today to be welcoming two guests from the U.S. Virgin Islands, one of our fellow U.S. territories, or if you're feeling frisky, one of our fellow U.S. colonies. And so for those of you who watch Fanachu, listen to Fanachu regularly, you know that one of the things that's very important for this podcast, for the work of independent Wahan in general, is of course solidarity, especially establishing solidarity with our fellow US colonies, learning more about what is happening in them, talking to people from them who can share sort of their stories of solidarity with us, who help us understand strategies they're using, who help us understand struggles that they encountered. And so over the past few years, we've had conversations with people from America and Samoa. We've been visited by Dr. Carlyle Corbin in the past, who's with us again today. And we've also, last year, we had 4 conversations with people from Puerto Rico talking about their movements for decolonization. And so I am so happy, though, to get to be dealing with updates on decolonization, the decolonization conversation there, constitution issues in the U.S. Virgin Islands with these two wonderful scholars. And so I have with me, of course, Dr. Carlyle Corbin, and friend of Fanachu, and a new friend to Fanachu, Dr. Hadiya Sewer. And so thank you so much, the both of you, for joining today. I'm really hoping that we can, that we can stories, that we learn what's going on in our fellow territory, our fellow islander across the seas, the empire. And so Hadiya, why don't we start with you? Go ahead and don't mind introduce yourself. And then Carlyle, you can go after that, and then we'll get into some of the updates and the issues.
Good day, everyone. Dr. Bavacqua, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful, as you mentioned, to always have opportunities to be in solidarity and also in conversation with fellow people who are colonized by the United States of America. Dr. Corbin, of course, it's always a pleasure to be able to learn from you and to advance a lot of the work on decolonization that you have laid an incredible foundation for. I am Dr. Hadiya Sewer. I am from the United States Virgin Islands originally. I was born in the island of St. Thomas. However, my background is in St. John, the quote unquote smallest of the 3 main islands that make up the United States Virgin Islands. I am currently a research affiliate in the African and African American Studies program at Stanford University, and I'm also a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. And so my academic work is focused primarily in Africana studies. And so I tend to look at questions of American colonialism in the United States Virgin Islands, often primarily with the lens of someone who is a philosopher, but also someone who's deeply invested in community organizing. And so many of my fellow Virgin Islanders know me as the president and co-founder of St. Janco, the St. John Heritage Collective, which is a land rights and cultural heritage preservation organization that really tries to be attentive to the needs of Virgin Islanders, especially those of us whose ancestry on island predates the establishment of the Virgin Islands National Park, as well as whose ancestry might predate American annexation. And I'm also a founding member of the Virgin Islands Studies Collective alongside Dr. Tammy Navarro, Tiffany Anique, and visual artist Lavon Bell. And so, that's a bit about who I am, but also, how I come to questions of self-determination in the United States Virgin Islands. So again, it's a pleasure to be with you both this evening, as well as with your listeners.
Sidzus Masi, and thank you so much, Dr. Sewer. And Carlyle?
Half a day, Dr. Bavakwa and all my friends in Guahan. It's great to be with you again. And I must welcome Dr. Sewer, who, of course, as you can see, is very active in many ways in the region. And we're very happy to have her to bring her work and focus to this broader concept of Caribbean, Pacific territories that are under the administration of the United States. I have been working as far as my own work in recent years. Of course, I had introduced the curriculum on dependency governance studies at UOG, University of Guam, and I had an opportunity to teach that course there or for a number of years before COVID. Certainly, also, my work has been with other non-U.S. territories as well. I've just finished a self-governance assessment in the British Virgin Islands, the other Virgin Islands, and also, of course, we collaborated with my good friend at the University of Guam with respect to the self-governance assessment and broader self-determination exercise with Ken, who in fact was very, very instrumental in bringing together the assessment for Guahan. So in these cases, those are the areas we're trying to look at: minimum standards using the self-governance indicators, which we were able to formulate some 10 years ago to determine the minimum standards for self-government. And I think that's where we are at the moment. And where we are, I think, will be moving forward and advanced by this dialogue we're having, and hopefully we can expand it to even include some others.
Wonderful. Yes, I would love that. And I'm really, really, really looking forward to the self-governance study, it being released sort of here on Guam. I mean, it's such an important document. And we'll be having, I'm sure we'll have a Fanachu episode focusing on that, how educators can use it, how people can use it sort of to understand our current status and where we might want to go next. But so I wanted to then sort of ask, one of the things that's frustrating about sort of us in all over the territories, right, is how, we're separated by oceans, we're separated by different sort of colonial restrictions. And even for Guam, which is right in the middle of Micronesia in the Pacific, sometimes the Micronesian islands around us might as well be in a different world because of sort of all of these divisions between us. And so I wish that your average person in Guam or the US Virgin Islands, that there was a stronger sense of sort of identification, that there was more knowledge about what is happening in each of the islands. And so that's why, and whoever would like to go first, please feel free to. What is the state of what I call the decolonization conversation in the US Virgin Islands? And so, and when I say that, because it's sometimes there's governmental aspects to it, sometimes it's scholarly, sometimes it's grassroots. So I just use conversation as a general way to kind of encompass a lot of different things, so that a territory which may have a different focus may not be left out. And so, Hadiya, would you like to go ahead and get started? Sort of, what is the state of the conversation?
Yes, thank you so much for this question. One of the things that I often tend to note is I refer often to historian like Christiana Fryer's work in her article, The Work of Disappointment, when I start to articulate what seems to be happening in conversations around decolonization in the Virgin Islands at this particular time. And so in a response to an article that was written by Yarmar and Mia, one of the things that Fryer asked was, it is possible, I think, to accept non-sovereignty as a category in global condition while wondering if those in non-sovereign states do. And if they do, how did they come to that acceptance? Or put another way, quote, when do dreams die and when do people begin forging something else in their wake? And I think this is always such an important statement by Fryer, in part because the conversations about decolonization in the Virgin Islands, I would argue, are stalling quite a bit. And so currently there was a referendum in November, essentially asked in November of 2020 to be specific, for Virgin Islanders to consider establishing a sixth constitutional convention whereby the delegates would be encouraged to adopt the revised Organic Act as a constitution for the Virgin Islands, with some provisions, of course, being made to amend the document and or to amend the Fifth Constitutional Convention's proposed document to create six constitutional proposal that can then be used moving forward. And in so many ways, this raises a lot of questions for us about not only political status, but also constitutional development, and thinking very critically about what pathways are possible or open to us as Virgin Islanders who may be interested in self-determination, or as Virgin Islanders who have become somewhat disappointed and or hopeless around conversations. And so I would argue there's a certain imperial pragmatism in how Virgin Islanders go about conversations about decolonization. And that pragmatism tends to propose incrementally increasing autonomy rather than prioritizing self-determination movements that would force us to choose one of the pathways that are on the table, whether that be statehood, independence, free association, or the status quo. And so, to be frank, I think those of us who are deeply invested in self-determination, we still find ourselves facing a mountain of work regarding how to continue to shed light on the work that has been done over the generations to pursue increased self-governance and or to pursue self-determination. And we hope for a future that's a bit brighter than our current situation.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Carlyle, I wanted to give you a chance though before, because I've already got some questions. People have already started sending in some questions. But Carlyle, did you want to add in anything?
Not really, just to the extent that the emphasis here is on the sixth convention and, well, the sixth initiative, sixth proposed document. And in effect, part of the reasons for the first five having been having had difficulty in adopting has to do with the fact that they had requested, and there were provisions in it that exceeded the parameters of the current arrangement. And so that fell foul with many of the players in terms, particularly in Washington and even internally. Some of the political directorate of the time indicated their displeasure, particularly the last one, the fifth constitutional proposed constitution, which in fact came out of the Constitutional Convention. And there were some provisions there specifically related to identity and other issues that caused some concerns, and ultimately in Washington. So I think the idea of establishing the parameters of what the box is full, if you will, can we exceed what we have now and still remain the same, or whether or not those things which we seek can be given only through another status. And I think that's one of the questions that has continuously been on the table. Of course, you also have other issues as well. And now our current initiative is to move toward a more pragmatic approach. I guess you would call it, and in the sense that looking at the adoption of the Organic Act, Revised Organic Act of 1954, and that would then, of course, result in knowing that this document has already been approved by Congress. Therefore, if we adopt it, then it would the chances are they would approve it as well. So we would change the name, and that would be the Constitution. My only concern on that issue, if that's the way we're going to move, then that's the way we're going to move. But my only concern is that the general public does not misinterpret what this means, because a constitution of a territory equals a territory, whether it's by organic act or by a constitution. So as a result, if we move forward from there, then I think that has to be clearly emphasized, that in fact this is what it is, and that we still have to deal with the question of being under the territorial clause, and there's been a lot of discussion about that. The other issues associated with that. So these are just some of the issues that I see in the context of this particular method of moving forward.
Thank you for that, because it is important, and that's one of the things that I think is lost sort of in this discussion, is that when as part of and I wonder if it's similar in the U.S. Virgin Islands, in Guam, when you hear Constitution, you think of white-wigged men that were white, had slaves, and sort of had some very interesting contradictory ideas about human freedom, and then wrote a constitution. And so a lot of times there's this misconception that when we talk about a constitution as a territory, we are giving it that power with actually none of the substance, because and so that's what I like, the way that you put it there. A constitution as a territory is, it's really just likely all it does is sort of paint the walls of the box that you're in like a new color, or perhaps sort of put some different posters on the walls. And so so one question that has come in, though, and it is an election in Guam, and so one of the things that we do every 2 years is, of course, we vote for our non-voting delegate to the U.S. Congress. And so the question comes, of course, asking that sort of in Guam, the current delegate has not been particularly engaging on these issues of political status. And in fact, he's the one who most recently suggested that we should start doing a constitution as a territory. What is the position of the U.S. Virgin Islands current delegate on these issues? Is the delegate engaged? Is the delegate not engaged? Because from Guam, for example, some delegates have been very engaged in this. Others have found these issues to be frustrating or irritating, not wanted to deal with them. From your perspectives, what is sort of the position of the current non-voting delegate?
Hadiya.
Yeah, so from my understanding, our delegate to Congress, Stacey Plaskett, is actually quite vocal about issues as it relates to our colonial status, and in so many ways has used her office as a way of highlighting what it means to be second-class citizens under U.S. empire, as well as highlighting just many of the ways in which our not being able to vote for the president of the United States and having a non-voting representative in Congress, how it impacts every aspect of our lives. And so Plaskett Congresswoman Plaskett has done a phenomenal job of even connecting the dots between disaster recovery and the disparate federal funding that we receive as people who live in a US colony. And so with that being said, has done a great deal of work to push for greater voting rights and access for territorial inhabitants in the US Virgin Islands. However, we don't necessarily have too many explicit conversations from our delegate about what a self-determination pathway might look like at this particular juncture in time.
Yeah, I would just add something to that as well. I think generally speaking, you have the Delegate Plaskett and also Delegate San Nicolas of Guam have been focusing, and other delegates as well, really going back several decades, have been focusing on more participation in the US system of political system. So we're talking about presidential votes, legislation, voting in the House. I think Delegate San Nicolas has recently introduced a measure to have a similar delegate to the US Senate. And I think that's something that even came from the previous Congress as well. But the idea is that this is really sort of moving in the direction of partial integration. It doesn't really focus on the self-determination process of options. And I think if in fact that's the way we wish to go, then the only method of gaining full political rights is becoming a state or becoming a part of an existing state. And I think if we go back as far as we go back on these initiatives, we will find that all of our delegates from day one have been introducing these things, and it's just been has not received the kind of response that has been projected. However, if we're focusing on a broader picture of full political rights, then those initiatives would come quite naturally under the integration column and that U.S. statehood, or otherwise we will always be, I refer to it as lesser unequal, or lesser inequality, and I think that's where we are standing right now at the moment.
Thank you for. Go ahead, Hadiya.
Say to add to that, I think that one of the critiques that I often find myself posing regarding the Sixth Constitutional Convention as it being a possibility that's now on the table for Virgin Islanders to potentially move in the direction of, is that in many ways it seems to circumvent giving the people of the Virgin Islands a comprehensive opportunity to really determine our political will. And so if we are to, convene a Sixth Constitutional Convention with the expectation that we would amend the Revised Organic Act of the Virgin Islands to propose as a proposed Sixth Constitution, in short, it doesn't give the people of the Virgin Islands a comprehensive opportunity to really grapple with the issues that came up in the previous constitutional conventions, as well as to respond to the memo that we got from the Department of Justice regarding their critiques of the proposed Fifth Convention's document, specifically the lack of explicit recognition of US sovereignty over the territory, as well as certain provisions that attempted to define and provide certain protections to people who were understood to be Native and ancestral Native Virgin Islanders, as well as its efforts to establish residency requirements and birth qualifications for certain political offices. And this becomes really important, I think, in so many ways, because often when we frame our political discourses around self-determination, I find that we tend to frame ourselves as scapegoats of empire. And what I mean by that is we focus specifically on some of the challenges of the previous convention as if it was simply the bad faith of the delegates who participated in the prior convention. And in doing so, we tend to overlook some of the ways in which our colonial relationship with the United States of America tends to overdetermine and pose certain challenges to our efforts to self-determine. And so one of the questions I often like, to ask people is, would the United States of America have been able to ratify a constitution if they needed the explicit approval of Britain? And I think that this becomes an important question for us because, at what point do we start to push back a bit more at the plenary power of Congress over us and go through channels that might allow for us to fight for a self-determination process that we would have greater control over. And I think this brings us back to the question of, well, should we prioritize this?
No, thank you for that that analogy of sort of the U.S. Constitution and Britain's involvement in it. It's an important one to remind people. It cuts through a lot of the fantasies that people have about sort of that just because you are writing a constitution under America doesn't mean that you get to play the role of Thomas Jefferson or Ben Franklin or whatever. That's not your role. Your role actually is that you basically get to watch them and copy what they wrote down. You get the honor of copying them. You don't get the honor of designing your own shoes. You get the honor of trying to fill their shoes. And so, but it's a great analogy there. And so I do have another question. And I want to come back to what you were mentioning, though, about sort of some of the things that have been in previous constitutions, because those are things that would definitely come up for Guam as well, about, what are the types of things that you can put into a constitution versus the types of things the federal government will say you are not allowed to put those things. But this question, though, goes to sort of the sentiments of the people in the Virgin Islands. So the question goes, a lot of the movement for self-determination in Guam was in tandem with sort of movements for indigenous rights, cultural revitalization. And so that sort of, as Chamorros began to see themselves as indigenous people deserving of protections, their language should be respected. This also then led to them feeling more political, more political aspirations. In the US Virgin Islands, are there similar sentiments? So, because you had mentioned sort of categories in previous constitutions for US Virgin Islanders or different types of people with ancestral ties to the Virgin Islands. In the Virgin Islands, are there movements for sort of indigenous recognition or localized recognition and so on?
So to answer that, yes and no. Yes, being that, of course, the Virgin Islands is a predominantly Afro-Caribbean population, and the language of Native and ancestral Native referred primarily to people who were born in the territory and the descendants of people born in the territory, and then ancestral Native, of course, referred to people who were here prior to like our conference of American citizenship and their descendants. You do have some Virgin Islanders who are also grappling with what it might mean to be Afro-Caribbean people who also have indigenous ancestry. However, those movements have not yet garnered enough widespread support in order to be able to understand how it might relate to our attempts to move towards constitutional development and self-determination. And so there are organizations in the territory such as Hadiya Taino that aim to educate and to raise awareness about people's indigenous ancestry in the Virgin Islands. However, we don't yet even see support at the level of the local or national government to recognize these efforts. And I think that we also may still need to do more research in that particular arena to further understand what indigeneity means to a predominantly Afro-Caribbean population.
Yeah, following up on that, I recall that the Treaty of Paris has the reference to native inhabitants, and the Treaty of Cession which transferred the Danish West Indies to the United States in 1917, has the same language, native inhabitants. So much of the legislation that we have looked at, including in Guahan as well, in terms of identifying those descendants of those native inhabitants, are their rights that this group of people have moving forward. And this is part of the dialogue, continues to be part of the dialogue in identifying that. Is this category a legal category that certainly can be addressed in contemporary terms? These are issues that unfortunately, we're having to address this through the US court system, which often does not give credence to the issue. And we, of course, is part of the reasons why we are looking at some of the international tribunals, I believe, in the context of looking at it particularly in the Pacific in relation to the indigenous rights, the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, as well as a number of the special rapporteurs in the case of Guahan, which has had that report come out very recently on the question of looking at the indigenous rights of the Chamorro people.
Oh, another question. So you had mentioned, one second. You had mentioned the idea of taking your organic act and making it your constitution. And so one of our viewers wants to know, what would be the value of doing that? What would be the value of doing that? Because if it's, and so, and I mean, in Guam, we also have that question because some elected leaders have suggested that we should just take the Organic Act, meet in a constitutional convention, and then pass it. And then we can say it's our constitution. And so within the, and of course, you know, for some people who are paying attention, that doesn't seem like a smart thing, or, you know, why would you even do it? But in the Virgin Islands, so what is the rationale, or what is the conversation around why that might be something that you would want to do?
You know, to be honest, I get this question often. I ask this question of myself and fellow Virgin Islanders often as well. And I'm often still very unclear on what the proposed advantages are to prioritizing constitution before status. And so my understanding, of course, is that it allows for restructuring of local government. It increases certain levels of autonomy. I have also, heard people note, proponents of adopting a sixth constitutional convention, that in many ways, this could advance the conversation of decolonization by continuing to put questions of constitutional development and self-determination on the table. However, you know, I would argue that there are also a great deal of drawbacks to prioritizing constitution before addressing the issue of status. I think one of the primary flaws that I see in this approach is that the Department of Justice memorandum to, you know, the people of the Virgin Islands essentially noted that we do have to speak to America's sovereignty over the territory in order to create a constitution that is amenable to US power. And so with that being said, while many of the proponents of prioritizing constitution first like to insist that we can separate the conversation of political status from the conversation of constitutional development, I would argue that these conversations and processes are deeply entangled. And in many ways, proposed constitution speaks to the political will of the people.
Yeah, indeed. I think part of that argument also is of the proponents of this is that we would effectively arrive at a situation where the document could then be amended locally, whereas any sort of an amendment to the Organic Act must be sent to Congress, and they have to amend it or consider amending it. It's the very smallest of small issues. Of course, whatever amendments that we would be able to do internally would still be subject to US court review if in fact something does occur which we may be exceeding the parameters of the current arrangement. But again, I think the issue of what it actually means in the context of reorganizing internally, the question of autonomy is you know, kind of questionable really in the context that it's still a territory with the limited autonomy that exists. But the idea that the concern, that my personal concern, is that we then recognize this movement and achievement as a fait accompli, and therefore that's all that we will ever need to do. And of course, once again, we still have not addressed the broader question of the fact that the democratic deficiencies existing in the territory with the Constitution or without. And I think Puerto Rico is a clear example of that, which has in fact a constitution from 1952, but yet they're still under the territorial clause, although they perhaps didn't think they were initially. But over time, the US court system, through various court decisions, have been clearly stated and clearly confirmed that, in fact, the territorial clause still applies to them. So this is the position that we're in, as I see it.
Thank you for that reminder about Puerto Rico, because proponents of a constitution before status in Guam have definitely tried to argue that Puerto Rico's had a constitution forever, and they're fine. No, you never hear Puerto Ricans complain about their political status. They're happy. They like to dance. They like to dance. They like to welcome all. They like to catch paper towels from Donald Trump. And so I think the reference to Puerto Rico is an important one, because when we can always, when thinking about our statuses as territories, we can always look to each other for sort of for reminders of what has happened, but also sort of potential warning signs for what may happen in the future. And so from the US Virgin Islands perspective, what are the lessons? Because Puerto Rico is same ocean as all of you, and the US Virgin Islands, of course, is Caribbean, so it's part of that part of the world. And so are there any lessons that the US Virgin Islands learns from Puerto Rico about its movements, about its struggles, because the Puerto Rican decolonization conversation is quite loud at times. It's sometimes wrapped up in US politics. So who has some thoughts on that?
Hadiya?
Hadiya?
Yeah, so I have many thoughts, and there are, I believe, like so many lessons that we can learn from Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans push for self-determination. In so many ways, we see strong, political status movements. We see the organization of political parties around questions of addressing the issue of self-determination. We also tend to draw a lot of inspiration from strong critiques of neoliberalism and the direction of development in Puerto Rico, and also in so many ways, even watching the many processes by which constitutional development, of course, did not guarantee the levels of self-governance that were initially hoped for. These are all lessons that we learned from as Virgin Islanders collectively. However, I think the thing that I am often most concerned about is that in some ways, as Virgin Islanders, I argue that we have internalized a certain level of aporia or hesitation, essentially meaning that when we look out at the wider Caribbean, when we look at Puerto Rico, when we look at the independent Caribbean, I believe that we have collectively reached a certain level of hopelessness and or despair that we mask as pragmatism. In short, when we look at the nationalist struggles in the Caribbean and we see the development that took place in their aftermath or our perceptions of said development, I think Virgin Islanders tend to internalize this as a warning sign of what could happen if we reject some of the imposition that we get from above in terms of reject some of the United States of America's input in our self-determination process. And then also there are some hesitations about what our viability and well-being might be in this particular territory, whether that be economically or in terms of cultural development if we were to pursue independence. And so in so many ways, I think that a lot of the silences that we have in our political discourses around self-determination are some internalized struggles with our understanding of how pushes for self-determination played out in Puerto Rico, but also in our other neighboring Caribbean islands.
Yes, in fact, that's a very excellent point. The Caribbean is a sea. The Pacific is an ocean, and the Caribbean has a number of non-independent countries, different dependency models, more so than any other region of the world. And this is an area where you have Dutch territories, French, US and British, and we're all, there's an interaction between amongst ourselves, but at the same time, the relationships with the administering powers tends to be quite different. So the extent to which we monitor developments, and similarly in the Pacific, where you have the French, New Caledonia, French Polynesia, you have the various associated states, you have the New Zealand arrangements with Cook Islands, Niue. So all of these are different. All of these are things that, in fact, inform us as to developing our own models of future reference. And in fact, Ken Cooper of the University of Guam, who did some excellent work on this in the context of the self-determination study, which examined all of these models with respect to different options that may be available. And we're looking forward to having that discussion, because this will have not only impact for Guahan, but also for the wider region and all the other territories in the Caribbean as well.
Let's actually, you've been moving towards sort of talking more about independence, and so of course my personal preference for Guam's political future is independence, and so I am curious to know, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, is there an interest in independence? Is it or is it something that people are primarily fearful of? Because in Guam, for a very long time, and it still is there now, there is sort of this fear of being independent and not being able to survive on your own, not being able to survive without the United States. Although we have seen a definite shift in that, where now sort of younger generations are more open to the ideas of independence, especially as the world's become more globalized. Our view of the world, even from a territory, even if life in a territory seems determined to make you focus on the United States as the center of your universe, people are just sort of absorb a more global regional outlook nowadays than they used to. And so is there an interest in the US Virgin Islands in independence, or is it a very small amount of people? Because in Guam, in surveys and in plebiscites, independence would sometimes get like 5% of the vote, or 4% or 3%. But some surveys shown more recently say 15% of the people. There have been a few student-run surveys that have said more than 20%, 25%. And so what is the interest of independence in the US Virgin Islands nowadays?
So nowadays, we do not actually have a widespread push for independence. And I would say that many of our popular conversations and our political discourses tend to echo some of the political discourses that you are describing as proliferating in Guam. Many Virgin Islanders do, let's say, on one hand, there's a certain collective political apathy where there aren't many public conversations and opportunities to really engage in conversations on political status that would allow for collective widespread consensus in one direction or another. However, there is also this fear of whether we as a people would be able to survive the quote unquote independence movement or decolonization process. With that being said, you do have organizers and activists in the Virgin Islands here and there who hold the minority opinion of desiring independence. And I often find myself being one of those individuals who have a preference for independence as a political status option. However, I want to actually highlight something that Mr. Biko McMillan said. He's a fellow Virgin Islander, a bit younger than myself, who is a poet, but also has been very vocal about his critiques of the proposed Sixth Constitutional Convention and Bill number 34-0153, which called for a Sixth Constitutional Convention. And one of the things he said as he prepared testimony that he has not yet had a chance to deliver was that, quote, "We must not allow anyone, foreign or domestic, to imply that we will forever need our colonizer to survive." And one of the things that he also mentioned in the remarks that he had prepared is something that we talk about a lot as Virgin Islanders, which is essentially just some of the processes by which political backlash is often leveraged to silence critiques of power that could lean in the direction of pro-independent sentiments. And so in some ways, I don't know that we have even an accurate assessment of Virgin Islanders' political will, in part because there is even some fear about what are the implications of speaking publicly on a contentious issue, such as political status or such as constitutional development.
Yes, I recall there was, in fact, in our history, dating back to the 1970s, there was, in fact, a political party, United People's Party, whose platform was included independence, but it didn't sustain over time. And you do have a situation where the actual option of independence is not seen in a proper context. I always say that independence in the 21st century is more interdependence. I mean, countries that have small populations, what have you, in our own region are doing quite well, not because they're affected by their size, but rather because they also have links with institutions, generally regional organizations, the international organizations, which input a number of areas for their sustainable development as they move forward. So one has to also look at options of free association and integration. Those are the three which are recognized under international law as giving the full measure of self-government. I think we've got to do a lot more in our discourse to understand the implications of those things. And I think that this is something which would benefit our movement as a whole. Perhaps after this constitutional exercise, which if in effect it does go through, then the next stage, as it is projected, is that we look at those options. And that is where it would be particularly important for us to have the information that we need in terms of the implications that for those three. Because in the end, the current status was never meant to be permanent. It was always meant to be transitional and preparatory to a permanent status. And this is where we are today. And I think what over time, we've kind of settled into the permanent non-permanence. And so we're a bit stuck in that mode. But I think perhaps over time, we will be able to move forward on this.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And we've got Hadiya, did you have more to add? Go ahead.
Well, I actually have a question for you. I'm curious
Sure.
about in discourses around self-determination in Guam, what forms and levels of solidarity do the people of Guam hope for from the rest of us in America's other insular areas? Like, what conversations specifically do you hope to have with us about issues of political status? And are there any specific topics or areas where you would hope for specific solidarity or action that we can all engage in collectively?
Ooh, that's a good question, because for me, at least for me personally, one of the most important first steps, and it's part of just a larger, because in Guam, so much about our lives is directed towards the United States, even though the continental United States is multiple time zones away, more than 10,000 miles away from Guam. And so it is always very problematic how we feel like we are intimately connected to somebody in San Diego, California, and we know almost nothing about the islands around us. That's problematic to me, or that we connect to countries in Asia through the United States, but we don't have our own relationships with Asia. And so, and then when it comes to the other territories, for me, it's always problematic because we don't know much about the other territories. And then for me, we should know, like when and actually I have a question which is very much connected to this, is that as a territory, before you learn about the 50 states, you should learn about the US territories. And it would be amazing if the school systems focused in that way, right? Because education is meant to prepare you for the world. But if you live in a colony, then it kind of prepares you for somebody else's world. It kind of prepares you to be lost in your own world. And so that's why for me, one of the most important things that we can do is just, and if it's possible in the Virgin Islands, I mean, one of the things that Carlyle and I have discussed before is if it's possible for there to be more regular educational exchanges between universities, absolutely media connections too. Because, so for example, if a news piece comes out in Guam, which talks about a constitution, your average newspaper journalist is not even going to think about the Virgin Islands. But for me, that's who you should absolutely think about, because that's your territory and solidarity. But going down this path, the next question is actually about this. How much are students in the US Virgin Islands taught about the US territories like Guam? Or is the curriculum in the US Virgin Islands very US centric? And this comes from Carlyle, Victoria Leon Guerrero, who is spearheading an effort to create elementary school social studies textbooks, which completely kind of throw out the old model. And so what is it like, sort of the educational system there? Is it US centric? Do you not learn about the territories until you're in college, basically? Or what is it like?
That's a really great question. In many ways, our education system is incredibly colonial in this regard. Many of us, at least, especially in my generation, grew up knowing very little about our fellow US territories, and to some extent, even the wider Caribbean, outside of whatever familial relations we might have with people in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And so with that being said, there have been movements to decolonize education, so to speak, in the Virgin Islands. We have had cases that have come forward to push for a curriculum in the Virgin Islands that's more comprehensive, with the intention of teaching more of, not only Virgin Islands history, but really the history of all people, including, of course, people from the wider Caribbean and the Pacific, and those who are also colonized by the United States of America. But, I'm also very saddened by the fact that it is, of course, a journey of self-education for many of us. A lot of what we know about even our colonial status and our history comes from either our education in college or our own intentional study in these particular areas. So I too, and I know many Virgin Islanders also, hope for a more comprehensive and critical decolonial education, especially one that could foster greater levels of solidarity. While, of course, it is also important to note the work that many individuals are doing, both at the University of the Virgin Islands and also in our education system, to push back. And so we have seen recent programs to teach more of Virgin Islands history. Specifically, there was a recent campaign to teach about D. Hamilton Jackson and his importance to the people of the Virgin Islands. But I do think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this regard.
Well, thank you. Carlyle, did you have anything to?
Well, just to echo what was said, and certainly the work that Victoria is doing at the University of Guam Press is outstanding in bringing together the issues of curricula all the way through from the lower levels, primary school levels, all the way through. And this is the kind of information to integrate into the school system so that we have an informed young population as emerging. And this is very critical for the sustainable evolution of our societies, respectively.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I heard stories from my grandparents about who grew up under when the US Navy was in control of Guam before World War II, and the way that the educational system was set up then. And even though, so at that point you couldn't speak Chamorro in school, it was prohibited. Um, but when you look at the curriculum nowadays, it's largely the same. My grandparents learned about the four seasons, even though there are not four seasons on Guam. My mom learned about the four seasons, even though there's not four seasons on Guam. My kids learn about the four seasons, even though you don't have four seasons on Guam. And so it's amazing to think that sort of you could go, we could still have these and as sort of as sort of islanders, you must face similar sort of things where your child will learn about sort of the biomes of the United States, but not learn anything sort of about the islands that they live on. So that you could grow up surrounded by coconut trees in Guam, but the school system will treat it as if they don't exist, except for sort of every once in a while, maybe when you're telling a Chamorro legend, or when it's March and you're celebrating Chamorro month and you learn how to weave something. But it's amazing that sort of we could have these educational systems which are so skewed, and they're still skewed, even though you can clearly and obviously see how skewed they are. Spencer, I could complain about that forever. I used to embarrass my kids whenever they would bring something home from school, and then they would be like, they would show it to me, and I'd be like, "What is this? How dare they? How dare they teach you this?" And then the kids stopped showing me their home a while, because you didn't want to get me worked up about it. But okay, so we are getting close to sort of the end of our hour, and so I wanted to give each of you sort of a chance to share some concluding thoughts. I mean, so a lot of people who are watching or who are listening, this may be sort of the most information that they ever get about the U.S. Virgin Islands, especially in this context, in the context of sort of solidarity between territories or colonies. And so, with that in mind, do you have anything that you want to share sort of about the state? Because, one thing coming from Guam, which is very strategically important to the United States, one thing I always want to remind people is, of course, that Guam is more than a military base. So if that's what you know about Guam, I always want to remind you that Guam is more than just a place North Korea targets. It is more than just a place that every once in a while gets a typhoon that hits it. It is the home to people who still haven't gotten their shot at self-determination. And so Hadiya, maybe if you want to go first, and sort of just what sort of concluding thoughts, and then Carlyle will go to you.
Yeah, so I have a couple concluding thoughts. One, I want to say, thank you for sharing a little bit about your decolonial parenting. I think it's always great to have examples and models of how parents can do a little bit of the work to push back against some of the colonial narratives that we get bombarded with, especially at a young age. As it relates to the Virgin Islands, I want to highlight just some of, the really beautiful work that a lot of Virgin Islanders are doing in a context that is often very difficult to navigate. And so, on one hand, I would like to note that, of course, when we talk about the coloniality of education, for us, a lot of that has taken the form in our lack of access to the archives. And so there's a certain coloniality of like archival production, but also maintenance. We find that our records are, of course, housed in the colonial powers for us, our former colonizer Denmark, and also the United States of America. And while there have been efforts to digitize some of these records, some of the gaps in our knowledge and also our public memory is very much rooted to how colonial governance is tied to a certain gatekeeping of the primary sources of, or some of the primary sources of our history. And so, with that being said, for me, it's always very important to really grapple with hesitation. And so, as we exist in this particular moment in our history where we aren't necessarily jumping to address the issue of political status, I think it's important to shed a critical lens on our relationship with the United States of America, but also to think through questions of, well, what kind of a colonial power is this particular nation, and how do we internalize some of the logic of how it wields domination. And so for us, I think that the question of political status really forces us to confront just some of the reasons why we might be fearful of advancing the issue of self-determination, and also to really just process just some of the moments in our history when those movements started to bubble and then were undermined by various forces. And so we're starting to see documentaries such as Our Island, Our Home, which was produced by Ms. Theodora Moorhead and directed by Dr. Crystal Fort Wrangler, which starts to tell a bit of the story of the American colonial period. And I think that we need more opportunities to understand how we got to this particular juncture, and also what possibilities for self-determination exist for us moving forward. And I always tend to advocate for trafficking in the realm of impossibility, because I think that pragmatism can be very seductive, but it's also, pragmatism can be an imperial force. And there are many opportunities, I think, to really just ask questions about whether it is possible to have greater levels of solidarity with the wider Caribbean and the Pacific, and in doing so, to not reconcile ourselves to the reality that self-determination may invite greater challenges, but really to challenge the prevailing economic structure that even renders that as a possibility in the quote-unquote post-colonial world. And so my closing remarks would be that, as Virgin Islanders, we have a lot more to work on and to consider. And I'm looking forward to increasing possibilities for solidarity in that regard.
Thank you so much for your statement, Sidus Masi. And Carlyle, your closing thoughts.
Well, I think Dr. Sewer encapsulated what needed to be said. And it's great that she's on this track with you, opening the realm for us to collaborate further on various levels, and certainly bringing in the discussion that we can bring in from other territories as well: American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, Guahan, U.S. Virgin Islands. But we also have, as we're mentioning, our neighbors, although they're not administered by the United States, they have similar colonial and dependency arrangements with other countries. They do have a role to play in our own analysis of where we are, how we arrived at where we are, and where we can go. And they have made some steps which perhaps could be very instructive for us to look forward to. So it's a wide realm. We refer to this in the context of dependency governance studies, and looking at all of these dependencies and looking at the way forward. And programs like yours, and it's consistent, very important that it's consistently produced, is something which I think is something which will continue to allow us to have this dialogue and enrich our awareness and knowledge of moving forward.
Sidus Masi, Carlyle, and yes, I think. Thank you so much, Hadiya. Your statement was so profound. I'm still actually processing it. And Carlyle, thank you for your important reminders. You are sort of you are such an important voice when it comes to solidarity and reminding people of sort of the larger, wider struggles, sort of beyond the colonial divisions, sort of looking past the veil. And so, but yes, I think one of the most important things for building up that solidarity of imagination, where people feel that their struggles are connected, is the consistency. is sort of that you regularly hear from, and then you see the patterns, you understand the connections, and then realize that sort of I may think of myself as being connected to somebody in San Diego and Las Vegas or something, but in truth, I'm actually more closely connected to these people in the Caribbean. Actually, these people in the Virgin Islands are the ones, when I get up in the morning, even though we are 10 time zones apart or so, we share a lot, and I should imagine myself moving in the same direction as them because our political realities put us in a similar place. And so, but yes, that's one thing that I always hoped with Fanachu, is just to keep regular sort of communication between territories. And so that's why, if to the both of you, if you're able to help find some other voices in the U.S. Virgin Islands, or if you're willing to come back sort of every couple of months just to check in about what's happening in your side of the empire, then I would love to do something like that, just so that sort of on different ends, we can recognize each other more easily. But yes, I've learned so much today, and I've gotten some comments from people who are saying, thank you for everything you shared today. 100 years, 100 years, nothing has changed, but we can change it together. And then thank you to Hadiya and Carlyle for sharing with us today. And so I want to end this. Episode para Fanachu. Thank you to those watching and those of you listening. We are finished with today's episode. Hadiya and Carlyle, Dr. Sewer and Dr. Corbin. Adios. Until we see each other again.